every signal humanity had ever received from deep space carried, buried somewhere in its structure, a timestamp that told you one simple thing: how long ago it was sent. A message from a star 40 light-years away was 40 years old the moment it arrived. A message from the edge of the visible universe was older than the Earth itself. That was not a rule. It was physics. It was the one certainty every astronomer, every signals analyst, every child who ever looked up and wondered what was out there, had been able to rely on since the very first radio dish was pointed at the sky. On a quiet Thursday night at the Threshold Deep Listening Array, orbiting silently beyond Neptune, that certainty broke, and nobody in the room understood at first just how badly. The signal came from a galaxy that did not exist anymore, not used to exist, and we're only now seeing its old light, the way every distant galaxy technically works. This galaxy had been formally reclassified 9 years earlier, after a century of careful observation, as extinguished, a galaxy whose stars had gone dark not through natural stellar death, but through something faster, more total, and more deliberate than anything in the astronomical record. Astronomers called it, informally, the Hollow, after the man who first proposed its existence and was laughed out of 2 conferences for doing so. It was cold. It was dead. Every star in it had been switched off, one by one, over a span of time too short to be natural, until nothing remained but drifting husks and silence. And from the exact center of that silence, at 11 minutes past midnight station time, a signal arrived. A structured signal, deliberately shaped, carrying inside it something the Threshold Array's junior analyst on duty that night would spend the rest of her life trying to describe to people who had not been in the room to hear it themselves. A human voice. Her name was Dr. Naomi Akoi, and she was 29 years old, 6 years out of her doctorate, and entirely too junior to be the one who found it. She had drawn the graveyard shift that week because everyone senior wanted the holiday off, and she had been half asleep over a cooling cup of tea when the anomaly flagged on her console, not with the polite chime the system used for routine detections, but with the harsh, insistent alarm reserved for signals that broke known physical models. She almost silenced it as a sensor glitch. She had silenced 2 of them already that shift, but something made her look at the source coordinates first, and when she saw them, cross-referenced instantly against the Threshold Array's own catalog, her hand actually shook on the console. The coordinates pointed directly at the Hollow. "That's not possible," she said out loud to an empty control room, because there was no one else awake to say it to. "That galaxy has been dark for 40,000 years." She was wrong about one crucial detail, though she would not learn how wrong for several more hours. The galaxy had not been dark for 40,000 years from its own perspective. It had been dark for 40,000 years by the time its light, and now, apparently, its signals had crossed the unimaginable gulf of space to reach a small blue and white world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. 40,000 years was simply how long the trip had taken. What the signal itself contained. Once Naomi Akoi and 11 of the finest signals analysts in the compact worked through the night and into the following morning to decode it, would turn out to matter far more than how old it was. Because buried inside the message, encoded with a precision and intentionality that made every scientist who examined it go quiet with something close to reverence, was a date. Not the date the signal was sent. A date describing when it was meant to arrive. The date was tomorrow. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself with sirens or panic. It moves quietly, from lab to lab, from office to office, in the hushed, careful voices of scientists trying very hard not to say the frightening part out loud until they were certain enough to be believed. By the time the decoded signal reached Fleet Admiral Priya Salink's desk at Compact Central Command, less than 18 hours after Naomi Akoi first flagged it, that quiet fear had already spread through every institution capable of understanding what it meant. A message, deliberately aimed and deliberately timed, sent by human voices, from the center of a galaxy that had been annihilated so thoroughly and so long ago that its own light had taken 40,000 years just to tell the rest of the universe it was gone. And whoever sent it had done the math precisely enough, across that entire span of time and space, to make certain it would arrive at Earth's doorstep on this exact date. Not next year, not next century, tomorrow. Admiral Salenk was 53 years old, a career naval officer. Th 3 decades of service and a reputation for being almost impossible to rattle. And when she finished reading the preliminary analysis report on that message, she sat in absolute silence at her desk for almost 4 full minutes before she spoke. "Get me Akoi," she finally said, "and get me everyone who has ever studied the Hollow seriously, however unpopular it made them. I want them all in a briefing room in 2 hours. If someone 40,000 years ago went to this much trouble to make sure this message found us on this exact date, I am not interested in waiting to find out why." Naomi Akoi had never expected to brief a fleet admiral in a secure command center less than a day after finding an anomalous signal on a quiet graveyard shift, and she stood at the front of that room with her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling, feeling every one of her 29 years and every gap in her experience she had never quite closed. "The message is layered," she explained, pulling up the decoded waveform on the room's main display. "The outer layer is a mathematical primer, prime sequences, physical constants, the kind of universal language you'd use if you needed absolute certainty that whoever received it, whatever they'd become in the time it took to arrive, could still decode it. That took us about 6 hours to work through, and honestly, it wasn't difficult. It was clearly designed by someone who wanted this message to survive being found by strangers who might have forgotten almost everything about the people who sent it." She swallowed and continued. "The inner layer is different. It's not mathematics. It's language. Old language, a dialect of English so archaic our linguistic models needed nearly 10 hours just to establish confident translation, cross-referenced against pre-expansion Earth records from almost 11,000 years ago. Whoever recorded this message was speaking a form of English that predates the founding of the compact itself by millennia, which tells us something important, Admiral. The people who sent this signal weren't recent. They were early, possibly among the very first human colony ships that left Earth during the long silence, back before instantaneous relay networks existed, before we had any reliable way of tracking where those early expeditions actually ended up." Admiral Salenk leaned forward. "You're saying humans reached that galaxy, physically, millennia ago on slow ships with no way home." "I'm saying the voice on this recording says exactly that," Naomi said quietly. "I think we should let her tell you herself." She played the recording. The voice that filled that briefing room was a woman's voice, weathered and steady, speaking in careful, deliberate cadence, as though she had rehearsed these words more times than she could count, determined to get them exactly right for an audience she would never live to meet. "My name is Imogen Reyes," the voice said, "overseer of the Meridian's Reach colony, 3rd generation born under a foreign sky. If you are hearing this, then the calculations my people have spent 400 years refining were correct, and this message has found you at the moment you needed it most. I do not know who you will be when you hear this. I do not know if the Earth still stands, or if the word human still means what it meant when my ancestors left it 11,000 years ago aboard a ship called the Providence, chasing a star system our earliest astronomers believed might be habitable. It was. We built a home there. We built 17 generations of a home there, in a galaxy we came to love as fiercely as any homeworld, before something came for it that we did not understand until it was already too late to stop." There was a pause in the recording, filled only with the faint hiss of ancient recording equipment, before the voice continued, and something in its steadiness cracked just slightly for the first time. "We called it the Withering because that is what it did to every star it touched. It did not announce itself. It did not attack our worlds directly, not at first. It came for the stars themselves, vast constructs, self-replicating, methodical, moving from system to system across our galaxy over the span of nearly 4 centuries, stripping each star of the very fusion that sustained it, folding that energy into itself, and moving on, leaving nothing behind but cold, dead husks and worlds no longer capable of supporting life. We fought it for 300 years. We built weapons our ancestors on Earth never imagined we would need. We lost. Not because we lacked courage, and not because we lacked ingenuity, but because by the time we understood what we were truly facing, it had already consumed too much of our galaxy to be stopped by anything we had left to throw at it. Admiral Solink's hands had gone very still on the table in front of her. Around the room, every officer, every scientist, sat in absolute unbroken silence. "I am recording this message," Imogen Reyes continued, "from what we believe will be among the final surviving outposts of our people. My son, Callum, died 11 days ago defending the relay station that will send this signal, buying the engineers the time they needed to complete the final targeting calculations. He was 34 years old. He never saw Earth. None of us ever did. And yet every single person who worked on this message, across 400 years of dying effort, dedicated themselves to it because we could not bear the thought of what came next happening to you, too, without warning, the way it happened to us." Her voice steadied again, and when she spoke the next words, they carried something that was not despair but a fierce, deliberate hope. "We have calculated, across 4 centuries of careful astronomical observation, the trajectory the Withering will most likely follow once it finishes consuming what remains of our galaxy. It moves slowly by any measure your generation is likely to use, but it moves with absolute purpose, and eventually, we believe, within a margin of error we have spent lifetimes narrowing, it will reach your galaxy too. This message is not simply a warning. It is everything we learned in 300 years of fighting a war we could not win, every weapon design that slowed it, even briefly, every weakness we found in its replication cycle, every mistake that cost us dearly, so that you will not have to make those same mistakes yourselves. We could not save ourselves. We have spent everything we had left making certain that does not mean you cannot save yourselves." The recording paused once more, and then Imogen Reyes said the words that would end up quoted within a week on every newsfeed across the compact, carved eventually into monuments on a dozen worlds, spoken by schoolchildren who would never fully understand the cost behind them. "We do not know if humanity, out there among the stars we left behind, still remembers where it came from, but we have never stopped being human, out here at the edge of everything in the dark at the end of our galaxy's story. And if there is one thing 11,000 years of distance could never take from us, it is this. We would rather spend our very last breath making sure you have a chance than spend it in despair alone, having done nothing at all. Fight well. Fight together. And please, when you build whatever comes next, remember that we loved this life as much as you love yours, and that love was never wasted, even here, even at the very end of everything." The recording ended. For a long moment, nobody in that briefing room spoke at all. It was Naomi Akoi, finally, who broke the silence, her voice unsteady but clear. "Admiral, there's one more piece. The reason the date matters. The reason it says tomorrow." She pulled up a new display, a long-range sensor sweep of the outer solar system, dated from earlier that same day, flagged by an automated anomaly detector that had, until that moment, been quietly ignored as a probable equipment fault. Colony Overseer Reyes said the Withering would eventually reach our galaxy. We assumed, when we first decoded this message, that we were talking about a threat that was still centuries or millennia away, given how long her signal took to reach us. We were wrong. Naomi's hands were shaking again as she highlighted a cluster of faint, barely there readings drifting at the edge of the Uit cloud. These readings started appearing 9 days ago. We dismissed them as sensor drift because nothing about them matched any known object classification. But once we understood what we were looking for, Once we cross-reference the technical specifications buried in the deeper layers of colony overseer Reyes' message, the propagation patterns, the energy signatures, the replication behavior she warned us about, the match is unmistakable. Admiral, there is a scouting vanguard of the Withering already inside our solar system. Based on its current trajectory and the acceleration curve embedded in the warning data, it reaches Earth's orbital defenses in approximately 19 hours. Tomorrow. The full technical archive attached to Imogen Reyes' message included something the analysts had not expected to find buried within it. Fragments of the colony's own historical record, compressed and appended almost as an afterthought, as though whoever assembled the final transmission could not bear to let 300 years of struggle vanish into the dark unremembered, even if no one on the receiving end ever had time to read more than the warning itself. Naomi Akoi read every word of it twice before the briefing, alone in the small hours before dawn, because she said afterward that she owed the people in those records at least that much attention before she asked the rest of the galaxy to trust their sacrifice. The colony of Meridian's Reach had been founded, according to those fragments, by the crew and passengers of a slow generation ship called the Providence, one of dozens launched from Earth during a period the records called the Long Silence, an era before instantaneous communication existed, when a colony ship left Earth accepting that it might never send word home again, and never receive any either. The Providence had traveled for nearly 200 years before its descendants finally settled a world they named Meridian's Reach, in a galaxy so distant from Earth that its original crew had known, going in, they were choosing a one-way journey for themselves, and for every generation that followed them. For nearly 400 years after that, Meridian's Reach had thrived. The records described orchards and universities, a system of self-governance built painstakingly from the values its founders carried with them across 2 centuries of transit, children who grew up under a sky full of unfamiliar constellations and loved it anyway, because it was the only sky they had ever known, and it was, in every way that mattered, home. There were festivals recorded in fragments of old civic archives, a Founders' Day held every year to commemorate the Providence's original crew, artwork and music that had evolved, over 4 centuries of isolation, into something distinctly its own, neither fully the culture of ancestral Earth nor anything else, simply, entirely itself. Then, according to the records, in a year the colony's calendar marked as its 381st since founding, the first Withering Scout appeared at the edge of their system, and everything after that became a war for survival that would not end, one way or another, for another 300 years. The colony's early military response, led in its opening decades by a commander named Imogen Reyes, Imogen's own great-great-grandfather according to the genealogical fragments attached to the archive, treated the threat initially the way any colony might treat an unknown hostile vessel, as an enemy that could be negotiated with, or at worst defeated through conventional force. It took 11 years and the loss of an entire outer settlement before Ephraim's own tactical logs, preserved in the archive, recorded the grim realization that would define the rest of the war. "It does not negotiate," he wrote, in an entry Naomi Akoi read aloud, her voice unsteady, during the emergency briefing. "It does not retreat. It does not appear to value its own individual constructs at all, only the completion of its feeding cycle. We are not fighting an enemy who can be reasoned with or worn down through attrition in any way our doctrine has ever prepared us for. We are fighting a process, and a process does not get tired and it does not stop until either it is finished or we are." The following 2 centuries, condensed in the archive into what the colony's historians clearly understood, even as they wrote it, would likely be the only record of their civilization anyone would ever read again, told a story of a people slowly, painfully, learning to fight a war unlike any their ancestors had prepared them for. They lost outer settlements one by one, evacuating what populations they could to increasingly crowded inner worlds. They developed the earliest versions of the harmonic disruption technology that would, 11,000 years and one galaxy later, save Earth's solar system, through a costly process of trial and error that the archive did not shy away from describing in full. The first working disruptor prototype, developed by a physicist named Halcyon Bayan roughly 140 years into the war, had required the sacrifice of 3 entire volunteer crews before the correct timing window was finally, definitively understood. "I want it recorded honestly," Halcyon Bayan had written, in a fragment preserved alongside her technical schematics, "that this discovery cost more than any of us were willing to pay, and we paid it anyway, because the alternative was watching everyone we loved die for nothing at all. If this data ever reaches anyone anywhere, I want them to understand exactly what it cost, so that they never have to pay that price twice." It was that same unwillingness to let sacrifice go unspoken, threading through nearly 3 centuries of records from dozens of different hands, that gave the compact analysts their clearest understanding of who Imogen Reyes truly was, and why her final message carried the particular weight that it did. She was not simply a survivor recording a warning in her final days. She was the last steward of a tradition, generations deep, of a people who had decided, over and over again, through defeat after defeat, that the truth of what they endured was worth preserving even when preserving it changed nothing at all for themselves. Her son Callum Reyes appeared throughout the archive's final years of records not as a footnote, but as someone the entire Ning colony had, by every account preserved, come to rely on completely. He had been the colony's chief relay engineer during its last decade, responsible for maintaining the increasingly fragile network of communication, arrays the dwindling population depended on to coordinate its final, desperate defense, and the personal log entries he left behind, appended to the main archive by his mother's own hand, painted a portrait of a man who had grown up entirely inside a losing war and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, refused to let it make him anything other than gentle. "I don't remember a time before the Withering," one of Callum's entries read, dated roughly a decade before the colony's final years. "Mother says I used to ask her, when I was very small, whether the stars we lost were sad about it, the way people are sad. She told me she never had a good answer for that, and I don't have one either, all these years later. But I think about it sometimes, out here doing relay maintenance under a sky with fewer and fewer lights in it every year, and I've decided the answer doesn't matter as much as what we do about it. The stars can't choose to fight back. We can. So we do, every day, for as long as we're able, because somebody has to be the one who refuses to let the dark just win by default." In the final entry of the archive attributed to him, dated 11 days before the message's transmission, and according to the timeline Naomi Akoi later reconstructed, written only hours before his death defending the relay station his mother would use to send her message, Callum Reyes wrote something that Admiral Solank would later have engraved, in full, on the memorial eventually built at Threshold Array. "If this reaches anyone at all, I hope they understand that we were not tragic. I know that is probably how our story will read to whoever finds it, all these centuries later, a colony that fought bravely and lost anyway, a story with a sad ending. I would like to gently disagree with that reading, if I am permitted to, from wherever this recording finds me by the time you hear it. We had 400 years under a sky we chose for ourselves. We built something worth defending, and we defended it with everything we had for exactly as long as we had it to defend. That is not a tragedy. That is simply a full life, lived honestly right up until the end of it. I am not afraid of what happens next. I am only glad, whoever you turn out to be, that some part of what we learned out here gets to keep helping people long after we're gone. Take care of each other. That's the whole of it, really. That's the only lesson that ever actually mattered." Admiral Solank read that final entry aloud, in full, during the public address that accompanied the release of Imogen Reyes' message to the entire compact. And in the hours that followed, "Take care of each other," became something closer to a rallying cry than a quote, appearing on hastily organized volunteer stations across a dozen worlds, painted onto the hulls of civilian ships redirected toward the defensive staging points. Spoken quietly by strangers to other strangers in 100 different languages, as though the whole of humanity had, in the space of a single desperate day, agreed without ever formally discussing it that those 5 words were the only response equal to what had just been asked of them. The date embedded in a message sent across 40,000 years, and an entire dead galaxy had not been calculated to mark when the signal itself would arrive. It had been calculated, with a precision that defied easy comprehension, to arrive exactly in time to warn a civilization about a threat that was, by devastating coincidence, or by some far more unsettling design nobody in that room wanted to consider too closely, already at their front door. What followed those next 19 hours would later be studied in military academies across the compact for generations, not because of the tactics involved, though those mattered too, but because of something far rarer in the history of any species facing sudden, existential danger: the almost complete absence of panic. Admiral Salenk did not order evacuations. She did not order secrecy. Within 3 hours of confirming the threat, the full contents of Imogen Reyes' message, the warning, the technical data, the history of a colony's 300-year war against an enemy that had already claimed one entire galaxy, were released publicly across every compact channel simultaneously, a decision that several of her own advisors argued against fiercely, warning of mass panic on a scale the compact had never had to manage. "They deserve to know what's coming, and they deserve to know why," Salenk told her advisors, in a meeting that was later declassified and became, in its own way, as widely quoted as Imogen Reyes' original recording. "A colony of our own people spent 400 years, and every Rissour. See, they had left, making sure this warning reached us in time to matter. I will not honor that sacrifice by hiding it from the very people it was meant to save. We are not going to fight this as a frightened species keeping secrets from itself. We are going to fight it as the species Imogen Reyes believed we still were, whether she ever got the chance to find out for certain." What happened next surprised even the compact's own strategists. Rather than panic, the release of the message triggered something closer to a planet-wide, then a system-wide mobilization unlike anything recorded since the earliest days of the war with the Ashari Dominion decades earlier. Engineers who had spent their careers in unrelated fields dropped everything to volunteer technical expertise once the warning's weapon schematics were made public. Independent shipping companies redirected entire fleets toward defensive staging points without waiting to be asked. Civilian research stations across a dozen worlds began running the embedded countermeasure data through their own simulations, looking for improvements, refinements, anything that might buy even a few more minutes of advantage against an enemy that had already ended one galaxy's worth of human hope. What happened next surprised even the compact's own strategists. Rather than panic, the release of the message triggered something closer to a planet-wide, then a system-wide mobilization unlike anything recorded since the earliest days of the war with the Ashari Dominion decades earlier. In the shipbuilding yards orbiting Mars, a shift supervisor named Teodora Lindqvist, who had spent 11 years overseeing the routine maintenance of civilian cargo haulers and had never once been near anything resembling a weapons program, walked into her yard's administrative office 4 hours after the warning went public and told her supervisor, without waiting to be asked, that her entire crew had already begun retrofitting 2 of the yard's largest haulers with improvised disruptor mounting frames, based on nothing more than the publicly released schematics and a shared conviction that idle hands help no one. "Nobody told us to," she said later, when a reporter asked who had authorized the retrofit. "We read what that woman's message cost her people, and we decided the least we owed her was not waiting around for a form to be signed. At a small agricultural research station on the outskirts of a farming settlement in the outer colonies, a semi-retired botanist named Aurelio Vance, who had not touched a weapons engineering textbook since his university years 50 years earlier, spent the entire night re-deriving the harmonic mathematics embedded in Imogen Reyes' technical archive from first principles, not because anyone had asked him to check the compact's own engineering teams, but because he said, in a message he sent unprompted to Threshold Array at 3 in the morning station time, that he wanted to be completely certain, in his own hands and his own understanding, that the numbers were sound before he could bring himself to sleep at all that night. His independent verification, forwarded up the chain by a bemused but grateful junior engineer, ended up catching a rounding error in one early prototype calculation that would have cost the lead disruptor several critical seconds of calibration time during the actual engagement. Civilian shipping guilds across 4 separate systems suspended all commercial contracts without being asked and redirected every available vessel toward the defensive staging points forming near Earth's outer orbital defenses, offering their ships, their crews, and in more than one case, their own untrained hands for whatever labor the compact's engineers needed done. Restaurant owners in the orbital habitats surrounding the staging points began providing free meals around the clock to exhausted volunteer crews, refusing payment from anyone wearing the temporary identification badges the compact had begun issuing to emergency mobilization personnel. Schoolteachers across a dozen worlds abandoned their planned lessons entirely and spent the day instead reading Imogen Reyes' message aloud to their students, many of them weeping openly in front of classrooms full of children who, for perhaps the first time in their young lives, watched an adult model exactly what it looked like to grieve for strangers and resolve to act anyway, in the very same breath. None of it had been ordered. None of it had been planned or coordinated through any formal compact directive. Admiral Solink, reviewing the sheer scale of spontaneous civilian mobilization occurring across the system in real time, would later describe it as the single most humbling 12 hours of her entire career. "I have commanded fleets," she said. "I have given orders that thousands of trained soldiers followed without question. I have never, in 30 years of service, seen anything like what happened. When we simply told people the truth and trusted them to decide, on their own, what they were willing to do about it." And observing all of it, with a mixture of professional detachment and something that would, by the end of those 19 hours, become very difficult for her to keep detached at all, was a representative of a species that had been quietly watching humanity's rise for decades from a careful, unbothered distance. The Kale. The Kale were not a species the compact knew well, and that was, in large part, by the Kale's own careful design. Ancient beyond easy reckoning, technologically far beyond most of the galaxy's younger species, the Kale had adopted, generations earlier, a philosophy of detached observation rather than active intervention, born from a long and painful history of watching civilizations they had once tried to help collapse anyway, undone by threats too large for even Kale assistance to meaningfully change. They watched, they recorded, they rarely if ever spoke. The Kale observer stationed quietly within compact space, a being who used the designation Sevri-ith in dealings with younger species, and had, over 11 years of careful cataloging, developed what could only be described as a detached scholarly curiosity about human behavior, requested emergency access to compact command channels within an hour of the Withering warning going public. The request was, after some hesitation, granted. "I have observed 6 species encounter warning of an approaching extinction-class threat in my recorded lifetime," Sevri-ith said, in the careful, measured cadence of a being for whom human urgency was still, after 11 years, something of an academic curiosity rather than a felt experience. In every prior case, the dominant response was either denial, prolonged internal conflict over resource allocation, or a collapse into factional self-interest that consumed critical response time the species did not have to spare. I would like to understand why your species appears, so far, to be doing none of those things. Admiral Solank, exhausted, running on her fourth hour without sleep and fewer than 16 hours from an engagement that could determine whether Earth's solar system survived intact, found herself, briefly, almost amused by the question. Because a mother 40,000 years and one dead galaxy away spent the last 4 centuries of her life making sure we wouldn't waste the warning she died giving us, she said. We don't have the luxury of infighting today, Ambassador. We have a debt to pay, and about 18 hours left to figure out how to pay it. Sevri Ith did not respond immediately. The Kale Observer spent, by their own later account, a significant portion of the following hours simply watching engineers work through exhaustion without complaint, watching volunteer pilots line up in numbers far exceeding what any defensive plan required, watching ordinary civilians on a dozen worlds organize supply chains and shelter networks not because any authority had ordered them to, but because the story of Imogen Reyes and her son Callum had, in the space of a single day, become something every human being who heard it seemed to feel some personal obligation toward. I do not understand it fully, Sevri Ith admitted, in a private communication log later released as part of the official compact record of the event, but I have begun to suspect that I have spent 11 years studying your species from the wrong distance entirely. I catalogued your conflicts. I catalogued your inefficiencies. I did not, until today, properly account for what happens when your species is given a reason large enough to set those inefficiencies aside completely. I would like, if you are willing to permit it, to observe what happens next from considerably closer than I have previously allowed myself. The Vanguard scout of the Withering, when it finally became visible to compact sensors in the final hours before contact, looked nothing like the sleek warships of the Ashari Dominion or any other threat humanity had faced before. It was vast, dark, and strange, a slow-moving lattice of angular constructs that seemed to drink the light around it rather than reflect it, exactly as Imogen Reyes' 400-year-old technical data had described. It carried no visible weapons in the conventional sense, because it did not need them. Its danger lay in what it did to the star it was slowly, patiently approaching. The beginning stages, replicated 1,000 times over across a dead galaxy, of a process that had ended an entire civilization's hope. But this time, humanity was not discovering that process for the first time, the way Imogen Reyes' ancestors had. This time, they had 400 years of hard-won knowledge, purchased at a cost no one in that command center would ever fully be able to repay, waiting for them the moment they needed it most. The countermeasures embedded in the Mesa were not weapons in the traditional sense either. Imogen Reyes' people had learned, at devastating cost, that the Withering's replication constructs were vulnerable during a brief window in their feeding cycle, when the energy they drew from a target star had to be processed through a structural core before being absorbed, a window during which a very specific, very precisely tuned harmonic disruption, delivered with exact timing, could cause the entire construct's feeding apparatus to catastrophically overload before it ever inflicted lasting damage on the star itself. It had taken Meridian's reach 300 years and the destruction of countless outposts to discover that window. It took compact engineers, working from that hard-won knowledge, less than 12 hours to build the first functioning harmonic disruptor prototype and rush it into position aboard 3 hastily repurposed research vessels, their crews entirely volunteers, none of them combat specialists, all of them absolutely certain of what they were risking and unwilling, every single one of them, to let anyone else take the risk in their place. Among those volunteers was Naomi Akoi herself, who had spent barely 36 hours as the most junior person in every room she'd been in since finding the signal, and who insisted, over the strenuous objections of nearly everyone senior to her, on being present aboard the lead vessel during the engagement. because she said, simply, that she had been the first person to hear Imogen Reyes' voice, and she was not willing to let anyone else be the one to answer it. "I'm not a soldier," she told Admiral Solink, in a conversation the Admiral later admitted nearly changed her mind about approving the request. "But I understand this signal better than anyone alive right now, and if something about the disruptor's timing needs adjusting in real time, out there in the moment, I want to be the one making that call." Colony Overseer Reyes didn't send this message so the person who found it could sit safely behind a desk, while other people risked everything to use it. The engagement, when it finally came, lasted 11 minutes, the same span of time, though no one in that command center would realize the strange, quiet symmetry of it until long afterward, that another human fleet, in another crisis entirely, had once spent threading an impossible needle to survive. 11 minutes in which 3 small, hastily armed research vessels closed the distance to a construct that had already, in another galaxy, proven capable of ending a civilization's 400-year war of resistance. The first disruptor pulse, fired at what Imogen Reyes' data indicated was the precise moment in the construct's feeding cycle, missed its optimal window by a fraction of a second, deflecting off the construct's outer lattice without meaningful effect. Naomi Akoi, monitoring the timing data in real time from the lead vessel's cramped auxiliary bridge, made the call that the official compact report would later credit with saving the engagement. A manual recalibration, executed under live fire, adjusting the disruptor's timing by a margin so small it would have been dismissed as statistical noise in any less desperate circumstance. The second pulse found its window exactly. The construct's feeding apparatus, mid-cycle, overloaded in a cascading failure that spread through its entire lattice structure in under 4 seconds. The vast, dark shape that had drunk the light around it for millennia finally, catastrophically, coming apart into harmless drifting debris. There was no cheering aboard the lead vessel in that first moment. Only silence and then, slowly, disbelieving relief, and then, finally, tears from more than one of the volunteer crew who had spent the last 18 hours certain they were flying toward a fight they might not survive. "We did it," Naomi Akoi said into the open comm channel, her voice cracking on every word. "Admiral, the Vanguard scout is neutralized. We did it. Colony Overseer Reyes, it worked. It actually worked." Sevri Ith, watching the entire engagement unfold from a compact observation platform, recorded, in the private log entry that would eventually be shared with humanity's own historians, as a gesture of what the Kale observer called, awkwardly and with visible effort, an attempt at genuine friendship, something that marked as significant a shift in Kale philosophy as anything in generations. "I've watched 6 civilizations face a threat of this scale," Sevri Ith wrote. "I watched all 6 of them fracture under the pressure of it, in ways large or small, and I concluded long ago that such fracturing was simply an inevitable property of mortal, finite minds confronting a danger too large to fully comprehend. I did not account for what a species is capable of when it has been given, freely and at devastating cost, the gift of not having to face that danger entirely alone. I do not kn. How if I yet understand humanity fully. I suspect I never will, not completely. But I have begun to understand, at least, why a mother 11,000 years dead was so certain her sacrifice would not be wasted on you. I would like to formally request, on behalf of my people, a closer and more permanent relationship with the compact going forward. I believe there is a great deal more my species could learn from studying yours properly, up close, rather than from the careful, comfortable distance I have preferred until today." The formal alliance that grew out of that request, in the months and years that followed, would eventually become one of the most consequential diplomatic developments in compact history. But on the night of the engagement itself, none of that mattered nearly as much as one simple fact. The Vanguard scout was destroyed, Earth's solar system was safe, at least for now, and somewhere at the edge of a galaxy that had died 40,000 years earlier. The final gift of a colony that fought and lost and refused, to its very last breath, to let that loss be meaningless, had finally, completely, done exactly what it was built to do. The weeks that followed the engagement were not simple, and no one who lived through them pretended otherwise. The Withering's vanguard scout had been only that, a scout, a single probing tendril of something far larger still consuming what remained of a dead galaxy tens of thousands of light-years away. Moving, by Imogen Reyes' own 400-year-old projections, slowly enough that humanity had time to prepare, but not so slowly that preparation could ever again be treated as optional. The compact began construction, within days, of a permanent defensive network built entirely around the countermeasure principles buried in Imogen Reyes' message, an effort that would eventually draw in resources and cooperation from a dozen allied species, the Kale among the first and most committed of them. But amid the enormous, sober work of preparing for a threat that would not fully arrive for generations yet, something smaller and quieter happened too, something that mattered just as much to the people who lived through those first weeks. Humanity began, in earnest, to properly remember Meridian's reach. A memorial was constructed at the threshold array itself, the same station where Naomi Akoi had first heard Imogen Reyes' voice, built not from salvaged wreckage this time, because there was no wreckage to salvage from a colony 40,000 years and an entire galaxy away, but from a simple, deliberate design. A single unbroken line of light, aimed permanently at the coordinates of the hollow, a beam that carried nothing but a repeating, looping return signal, broadcast continuously into the dark in case, against every reasonable expectation, there was still anyone left out there to hear it. There was no reply. Everyone who worked on the memorial understood, going in, that there almost certainly never would be. Imogen Reyes had recorded her message from what she herself called among the last surviving outposts of her people, 11,000 years after their ancestors first left Earth, and 40,000 years had passed since then on top of that. The mathematics of the situation left very little room for hope that anyone remained to hear a reply. But Naomi Akoi, who was placed in charge of the memorial's construction at her own request, insisted on building it anyway. She sent a message across 40,000 years without any certainty at all that anyone would still be listening, Naomi told the small crowd gathered for the memorial's activation. She didn't do it because she expected an answer. She did it because refusing to try felt, to her, and to everyone who built that signal alongside her, like the one thing worse than dying. I think the least we can do, the very least, is make sure that if there is anyone left out there in that dark, impossible silence, they know we heard her. They know it mattered. They know that somewhere, 11,000 years and one whole galaxy away from the home she never got to see, a woman named Imogen Reyes and a son named Callum Reyes saved us, and we are never, ever going to let the universe forget their names. Admiral Salenk, in her own formal address to the Compact Assembly weeks later, was asked by a young delegate what single lesson she believed humanity should carry forward from the events at Threshold Array. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, and the slower, generational work of preparing for the Withering's eventual full arrival had begun in earnest. She thought about the question for a long moment before answering, the way people often do when the true answer matters too much to give carelessly. "I think the lesson isn't really about the Withering at all," she finally said. "The lesson is about what Imogen Reyes chose to do with the very last thing she had left to give. She had no reason to believe her message would ever be found. She had every reason honestly to give in to despair. Her home was gone, her son was gone, everyone she had ever loved was either dead or about to be. And she chose, instead, to spend her final effort making sure a group of strangers 11,000 years and one galaxy removed from her would have a fighting chance she never got. That is not a lesson about aliens or star-eating machines or ancient signals. That is a lesson about what we owe each other across any distance, across any span of time, simply because we are capable of choosing to care. I hope we never stop choosing it. I hope, whatever comes for us next, that some version of Imogen Reyes' choice is always the one we make too. There is a question people sometimes ask when they first hear the full story of the signal that arrived from a dead galaxy carrying a human voice and an impossible date. And it is, in its own way, the same question every story like this one eventually circles back to. Why would anyone spend 400 years and everything they had left on a message they would never live to see delivered for people they would never live to meet? The answer Imogen Reyes gave in the last words of her recording is the only answer this story has ever really needed. She did not send that message because she expected gratitude or glory or even certainty that anyone was still listening. She sent it because somewhere in the dying light of a galaxy that had already lost everything, she understood something that no amount of distance or time could ever fully erase. That love, given freely, aimed carefully across an impossible gulf toward people you will never meet, is never truly wasted. It finds its way home eventually, however long the journey takes, however dark the silence in between. If you have ever wondered whether the smallest, quietest acts of care you offer the world might outlast you, might matter to someone you will never meet, in a future you will never see, then perhaps you already understand what Imogen Reyes understood, alone at the edge of everything, 40,000 years ago. And if this story stayed with you, perhaps carry it forward the way that signal was carried forward, quietly, patiently, toward whoever needs to hear it next. Because somewhere out there, someone is always listening for exactly the kind of hope you have to give.